Hey folks, welcome along to MCP Week. In this video, I'm going to be talking to Kevin Swiber, API strategy consultant of many, many years, having spent time at Postman and Apogee, as well as advising the Open API initiative. He's no stranger to this channel. Kevin, welcome. Do you want to give us a quick introduction and talk about some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, sure. That was a great intro. But I've been in the API space for about 15 years now. I've seen all the trends come and go. My initial place of work was in the enterprise, so working in large enterprises, and kind of quickly moved over to work for API product companies. So a lot of times I sit with this kind of enterprise mindset when working with products, and like to try to stay close to what real people are doing in real jobs in the enterprises across the world.
Well, we're talking about MCP. That's a big theme of what we're doing this week. And, you've become very, very close to the world of MCP, keeping an eye on, everyone and everything that seems to be going on in that space. I think maybe it would be useful for the uninitiated to, if you could give us a quick introduction to what MCP actually is, because I tend to throw that term around pretty loosely already, and actually I realize there's still plenty of people out there that don't actually know what that means.
Yeah, so MCP is Model Context Protocol. It really became a thing to even look at as chat interface applications like ChatGPT and Claude became a lot more popular. One of the first problems that we ran into in using large language models is that we need to give it more context, right? It always needs more context so it can actually give us valid information back and help answer whatever questions that we have. And we've gone through kind of a few different phases of how to do that. One interesting way of doing this is to actually have external tools to feed information and to feed functionality to that LLM experience. And so that's what MCP really does. It lets us have our chat interface application, and it lets us have external servers that can provide more tools for accomplishing tasks. It can have more resources for extra data that it needs to bring in. It can have prompt templates and a couple of other things. But it's solving what they call an M times N problem. If you've got 5 different clients and you've got 5 different servers, then you've got like 25 different kind of relationships to build there. Having some kind of standard like MCP in the middle means that we can just build clients for MCP and we can build servers for MCP, and it becomes an M plus N problem, as they call it. So really allowing us to move faster in this world by introducing standards.
Maybe it might be helpful to talk about some of the misconceptions as well, because this has been something that's happened so quickly, right? Anthropic only released their approach to MCP at the end of November of 2024. We're only right at the beginning of June 2025 right now. So it was 6 months. And in that time, an enormous amount has gone on with it. But what are people mistaking about MCP as it stands right now? What do they think it is versus what it actually is?
I think the biggest misconception has been that MCP is going to replace APIs. It's just, when we see new technology come out, I think we always go to, well, what can this replace in sort of my knowledge bank? Like, what can I move out of my memory to move this into my memory? But the reality hardly ever unfolds that way, right? Like when GraphQL was becoming popular, for instance, tons of people were saying GraphQL is going to kill RESTful APIs, and we didn't really see that. What we see even in large enterprises today is that there are still tons of RESTful APIs there, and in addition to that, there are GraphQL APIs. Right, so I think MCP is going to work in a similar fashion, where we have our traditional RESTful APIs. Maybe we've got some GraphQL and some other technologies in there as well, but we also have MCP as we're looking at a new interaction model with with chat interfaces, even autonomously. Right, there's a new interaction model there. these what we're used to doing a lot of deterministic programming. There's now a lot of probabilistic outcomes that we have to face, and that requires new solutions as well. But that doesn't obviate the need for the old solutions we have. And much like we saw with API gateway technology coming out, 12 years ago, we were convincing people that they should have an API at all. And maybe they had like a SOAP service in the background, right? And we would start putting like gateways in front of that to keep the SOAP service, but to have an API interface. It's just a new interface. It's a new interaction model. And the old stuff is going to be there. There's still SOAP services out there, right? And APIs, we've been playing this API game for a long time. So, I think technology disappearing is a really rare event. There are still COBOL programmers out there. There are still mainframe developers out there. This stuff doesn't just disappear. And while it, can get lots of reactions on the internet of saying MCP kills APIs, I just think it doesn't really reflect the reality that we'll see over the next few years.
Yeah, it's good LinkedIn fodder to be as hyperbolic around MCP as to say that it is the API killer, when in fact actually it's just a consumption method, or really a transport between the new interfaces that we're using and the APIs that live behind them, right? Just stacking layers ultimately, right? The SOAP that sits on top of the gateway with the REST, and the MCP that sits on top of that, and your ultimate, consumption model, whatever it is, whether it's something in Cursor or whether it's a chat interface, it's just going to be like that. And everything's still there, right? Nothing has changed. We've just created a new way for people to access this information, or the data behind it, in a way that isn't as, I guess, direct as hitting an API endpoint for a specific thing is, right? Because MCP is very much about, the presentation of, tools that are there for consumption, right? Which can be, and maybe in many ways need to be, perhaps making multiple API calls, under the surface in order to achieve what it is that it's decided it needs to do.
Right. And in that sense, MCP could actually become the biggest API consumer out there, right? Like, because your MCP operations are going to have to make multiple API calls as you're designing that MCP interface for that natural language experience. There are probably going to be multiple API calls that happen on the back end. So, instead of killing APIs, I think actually API business is going to be booming for MCP. And one of the benefits of MCP, in my opinion, is that we've got tons of API developers out there right now who know how to build APIs. There aren't quite as many people who are ML engineers or data scientists, right? And so all of these developers have been asking, how do I play in this world? How do I start contributing to this ecosystem, this really cool natural language interface, these natural language experiences? How do I contribute to that without, having a degree in data science? And MCP really says, actually, as long as you can make some kind of protocol server, you can play in this game. You can have a seat at the table. And so I think that's one reason that it's becoming so popular now. It's because we're starting to realize that there's a very large developer audience out there who actually might be quite comfortable building MCP servers that in turn utilize API servers that they've built previously.
I mean, previously as well, as developers, you had the consideration of, okay, I'm going to be building an API, and I don't want there to be, enormous responses coming back in JSON form, let's say, and then having to figure out how to handle that, especially on kind of like in a front-end experience, right? The bigger the request, the longer that's going to, be until you get initial pain to various other things. And that was something that was a main consideration for people. Then GraphQL came along as kind of an alternative to that, right? Only return what it is that you need, right? So you've got smaller overall responses. Now we're in a situation where the consideration has to start to be for all of those things, but also how much of the context window am I going to mess up with the responses here, and now I have to think about how to package what it is that this MCP server is actually requesting, and getting the response back in a way that isn't going to blow up the context window too much and not be, filling it with all of this information or possibilities that people might want to actually, use with the particular server, and actually keep it relatively limited to a smaller set of tools that are ultimately going to orchestrate stuff on the back end, both in terms of the inbound request, but also the response that it's going to bring too.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point about MCP design that I don't see a whole lot of folks talking about right now. But because this is a new interface model, we do need to think about what the design looks like for that interaction. And it's probably not going to look exactly like your API and your API consumers, because your consumption looks a lot different in working with LLMs and in MCP. And so I think it's going to be super important to get that design right. And there are new constraints. You mentioned like the context window being one of them. Another one is that LLMs don't really handle a large number of tool options very well. So, if your API has 100 different operations and you expose each one of those operations to the LLM, it's going to have a hard time choosing the right one. So we need to think in terms of design, not only how that's going to impact the natural language interface of the end user, but also how is this going to integrate with the large language model and provide the best user experience that we can. And to do that, we need some very deliberate design. And I think all of those best practices haven't really been figured out yet, right? Like we're still very early on in MCP. But certainly, I could see a world where MCP design becomes a product category that, folks are trying to help out with.
I mean, we've seen it previously with people, coming in and doing straight up API design. There is a different way of thinking that you need to start to maintain. And, the best practices that we've seen for such a long time, across the web of, like API design best practices and all of this stuff is now already giving way to, MCP design and, LLM consumption design best practices, and how to build tools in such a way that, they aren't going to, cause havoc inside of the LLM and within that particular context window, not eat up all your tokens and cost you a bunch of money. The whole aspect of what people need to think about is changing. And that's when we go back to said at the beginning, we think about that. It's been 6 months since that began, and already there's a very, very different approach that's manifesting as to how you actually build for API consumption these days. It's absolutely fascinating that it's gone that quickly. I don't remember really anything across the time that I've been working in software, like anything moving at that kind of speed.
Yeah, we're in interesting times, right? Like even the World Wide Web did not take off this fast.
Yeah.
But we're in different times where we have excellent distribution models. Like you can make a post on social media and get access to so many more people than you would have been able to in the 90s. So when these things really take off, like they really take off, and I can't recall seeing anything that's taken off as well as MCP has, in the last 30 years, really.
Folks are rushing these days as well to get on top of stuff. The FOMO is very real, and people don't want to miss out. They see an ability to try to be first movers in the space, and because of that, they kind of run straight into doing it. And especially around the world of AI and LLMs, I think people are even more keen to do that so that they can try to either shift the company that they're already building towards more AI readiness that they think that it needs, or just to ensure that they kind of like have a way to talk about something that is relevant enough to keep them relevant as well. Do you see, and I'm curious to know as well from the people that you're working with at the moment too, do you see like security concerns kind of coming up here, and like the possibility of people causing some pretty catastrophic errors?
Yeah, I mean there are some major security concerns with MCP right now, particularly in the remote MCP servers. The Anthropic team and the community around MCP has done an incredible job taking feedback and iterating on the specification to improve security. So, huge kudos to those folks and that team. They're really responding to the needs out there. But working with companies who are looking to adopt MCP right now, like first, usually there's a ton of developers who are really interested in this. The push that I'm seeing isn't necessarily coming from business users. It's usually the technology team. And if you think about it, like right now, MCP, to configure MCP in your Claude desktop app or whatever, or cursor, you're editing a JSON file mostly, right? And even that interface is just not really ready for business users. So everything is sort of really being driven by technology folks now. Now that said, the technology teams are incredibly interested in deriving some kind of value from this, and so they are talking about it internally, and they are trying to come up with strategies. And the two things that sort of come up there are risk mitigation and value creation. So risk mitigation is huge and will probably involve a security team. Definitely working with security teams now who are saying like, okay, MCP is coming. How do we do this in the most secure way? And then I'm working with folks who are saying, MCP is coming. How do I get this out to my partner network as fast as I possibly can? So, we can have better interoperability with the natural language interface. So really those two things are driving or maybe are the result of MCP growing in organizations, right? And those are two things that every company has to think about all the time: risk mitigation and value creation, right? So it's not too surprising. But certainly a lot of security people are trying to figure it out right now, and some of the best like security minds out there are working on this problem for MCP, and some old dusty standards that haven't had traction in a while around authorization are starting to see some traction, right? Because folks are like, actually, we do need this incredibly difficult to understand authorization model to be standardized somewhere and implemented. So it's really fascinating times, I think.
It does now feel like there is enough motivation out there for people to really push things into that next level. And I think the bonus you get from that is that it goes from being relatively difficult to understand to lots of people influencing it, lots of people figuring out how to tell the story of it much better, and then also creating a lot of content and lots of good documentation and lots of good examples about how to do that implementation, so that people aren't quite so stuck in that, oh, it's really hard, so I'm going to ignore it, to actually, now we've got enough basis here to people to educate themselves on how to do this properly, which is great because I love that kind of speed. And when that motivation really happens, at that kind of speed, it ultimately ends up being very rewarding as a developer, because you end up with lots of new things to play with, but also plenty of people who are out there understanding it very, very quickly, and then creating all of the information that you need to go ahead and understand it for yourself. Even if you don't want to dig through it, on your own, there's going to be plenty very, very quickly. I mean, the amount of content that's already been created around MCP is just incredible, but the actual implementation side of things is still relatively lightweight, because a lot of people are just touching the surface of how they're actually going to do their integrations and how they're going to build stuff. Hopefully those best practices will come to the fore, but also the ability to teach yourself those best practices will come about pretty quickly too. I read the other day a post of yours on LinkedIn where you were talking about MCP's ability to inspire people to create. Could you expand on what you were talking about there? Because I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. So, when I started programming, it was the mid '90s, and the web was really exciting, and programming for the web was incredibly exciting. And one of the first things I did actually was start a developer education company and start teaching other people how to do this, right? Because the excitement was just there for doing this sort of thing, and I'm really starting to get a little nostalgic around that, because it feels like that excitement is here again for MCP. It feels like this is reaching out to folks who are, maybe somewhat technical but wouldn't consider themselves developers, and they're starting to say, hey, I think maybe I could build an MCP server. I think maybe I could do this to interact with different tools or different data that I have locally. So how do I get started? And it's really exciting times for me when the pool of developers out there is going to potentially grow. And I think AI, while there are a lot of people saying AI is going to replace software developers entirely, I really feel the opposite is true, where it's going to, make the bridge into development exist where it did not exist before. It's going to reach new people. And so, I see MCP like firing this off in people's heads of going, maybe I can program too. Maybe I can do this too. And so, I think when we talk about tool makers in this space, we need to really remind them or remind ourselves that some of our audience out there might just be coming to tech for the first time. And so this, maybe having completely advanced controls from the get-go, maybe there needs to be a little better design around that, because what we want to do is get these folks up and running as quickly as possible and feel that magic, and really continue their journey here. And one sort of aspect of this that I think really helped the web at the time was this concept of view source, where you could view the source of a web page. You can see the HTML that was putting it together. You could copy it yourself. You can play around with it, change it, make some edits, and then see those changes and get kind of this feedback loop going. One interesting thought that I had was with all these tools that we have that are taking Open API descriptions and turning those into MCP servers. The Open API description itself can almost be a view source document in this case. And if you can do things like stand up mock servers on top of it, there's so much you can do with that. And so if one of these new developers goes into Open API and learns that format, there's so much that they can do. Just from that one set of lessons around Open API. And I think Open API is not the end format for MCP, but it's a gateway. And there are formats like Arazo that take Open API operations and put them into workflows. I think that's probably a better fit for MCP, but that's maybe a whole other conversation. The point is, these documents that are easy for human beings to read and to write are an excellent gateway into this world of programming, into the world of AI, and through MCP.
You don't even have to go out and figure out Open API anymore, right? You can just open up your favorite tool, whatever it is, and ask it to create an Open API document for the API that you want to build for this service. And even with, and as I know, and there are plenty of videos on the channel where I do this, relatively minimal prompts now, you can get some really, really high quality Open API documents out of that you can have stood up with a service, say Mockbin, for instance, that we have here at Zuplo, straight away, and then you could be building it just in a couple of seconds to do that. And I think that's absolutely like what you're saying. That was the rush of view source for us back in the day. Is the same as being able to do that now, but the outcome of what you can achieve today is so significant. Where I was trying to figure out how to make a WAV file play in the background of an HTML page. These days people are going to be able to mock and spin up an API and build tooling on top of it in about the same amount of time, if not quicker, which is unbelievable, really, and super exciting. From a developer relations perspective, this is changing things as well, because previously, and as you have and as I have worked around that world of kind of doing developer go-to-market and developer relations work for API companies, the way that people are consuming APIs is changing, right, rapidly. And from a developer experience point of view, that really changes quite a lot of things in terms of how you would approach that now. What do you think that, for people in our position, or who are building, particularly developer first or developer tools companies, what do they need to start considering now from a developer experience point of view when it comes to all of this stuff?
Yeah, I think a big change is that the entry point into education is no longer going to be your website for a lot of people, right? It's not going to be your docs site. It's going to be, their chat GPT. It's going to be their Claude, whatever sort of chat interface they prefer. Maybe Perplexity. They're going to own sort of that experience that's close to them. And then, we've got to figure out a way to provide all that information to that chat interface, and there are a bunch of standards out there to try to do that today. There's LLMs.txt that allows you to have better content that you can feed to LLMs from your website. But yeah, I think the way people learn is well, maybe not the way they learn, but how they get access to the information to educate themselves is changing. And so I think we need to figure out how to meet them where they are. And I think all the technology for that probably isn't available yet. But I can definitely imagine a world where you can have a better integrated experience with someone through their chat interface, just by hosting some stuff on your own. They could still own kind of that front end experience, just like, maybe Google owns the browser you're using, or, Apple owns the browser you're using. And you have kind of your own bookmarks and tabs, and you've got your own experience there. Similar things can happen with AI, natural language interactions, right? And we've found a way to make that work over time to kind of blend those experiences on the web, and I think there's probably a lot of patterns we can reuse for that as well. But I think the goals remain the same of trying to educate people and get them to a delighted experience as quickly as possible. And I really think we don't know yet how this is all changing, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on.
We're at a point now where you can go into, most LLM chat interfaces and say, I want to do this with a piece of technology. Can you give me a recommendation on like 3 that I should go and check out? And it'll do it. And, it's mostly based off of like SEO and some answer engine optimizations that have been taking place. And that's great. But I kind of feel like we aren't too far away now from it being like, here are the 3 choices of technology I think you should consider. Would you like to set up an account with option 1? And, through a method of kind of like, MCP server discovery, actually have like the registration MCP server for said company, there that it could go pull out, hook it up and then say, okay, now you can go through the process of registering your account right here as well. So again, like you never even need to go to the website. It's like, okay, well now the account's set up. You could start working with it. Do you want to generate an API key? Okay, yes, I would like that. And then your API key is automatically generated in the same pattern. And it's like, okay, well, can you then show me the getting started documentation for that service as well? And then it's all done. And if you imagine this in the context of just working inside of something like Cursor, it's like, that's it, right? I've not gone to any website. I've been here the entire time. I have my account, I've got my API key, and I have the documentation for Hello World. Let's go. And, go from that point. And it does kind of feel like, I'd say maybe even before we get to the end of this year, that could well be possible.
Yeah, and I think one really cool thing about that model, even though it is kind of different than what we have today, is that it allows a lot more personalization in the education of the person who's doing it, right? If the LLM knows the preferences of the person it's working with, and how they learn best and how they consume information best, then it can really provide that experience that is better suited for the individual. Something that you can't do very well with a web presence, right? Because you just don't have access to all that kind of personalization detail about the user. So I think, I think this is all net positive, all really good stuff. And yeah, maybe by the end of the year, we'll start seeing some of that.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how well that goes for me in terms of a prediction. Fingers crossed. I think basing that off of a little bit of knowledge around how some of the authentication stuff is going to be working for remote MCP servers, and the use of .well-known already for some kind of like discovery purposes. It feels like it couldn't possibly be that far away, really. Which again is going to be kind of super exciting, and actually then figuring out how you build your onboarding experiences, which so many people have spent so much time on for a web-based approach. When it comes to like, okay, well, now how do you onboard people when they're just coming through a chat interface? What does that look like? That's going to be a really fascinating overall user experience challenge to put people through. One that I'm quite excited about, actually.
I think the best way to think about this is in terms of fun. Like we can have a lot of fun doing this. Another angle to look at it is that it's incredibly disruptive to what we have today. But I'd rather take a more joyful approach and say these are new, exciting opportunities for us. Let's have fun doing our best.
I'm curious on one more topic, and that's something that I think people are obviously going to be thinking about as well. We're plugging all of these services into these new interfaces and these new ways of working, but how we actually monetize stuff may well change in this case as well. I'm curious on your thoughts around how some of this MCP side of things could potentially be monetized. If you've got any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I think authorization is the problem that we have to fix first before we get into payment trust, right?
Yeah.
And so like we're getting there. But I do know some founders who are kind of experimenting with this right now. One founder that I work with has a MCP server out there that people internally can use to change his email signature. And in order to do that, you need to actually submit a payment through Coinbase. So just kind of like using APIs, you can do kind of a payment in order to make some kind of change happen out there. I do think that, we will get to a point where money exchange is happening over this interface. I mean, if you think of like, a Google Pay or an Apple Pay, you could really easily see these things get integrated into these chat interfaces. They're already integrated into our messages, right? So, I think that's going to happen. It will probably be a while before we're doing straight like bank to bank transactions over that interface. But I can see payments popping in there pretty easily. We can still leverage a lot of what we have on the web, right? The web isn't going away, so we can tie into that just as we do today. If you're running an MCP server that needs your access credentials and you have to log in through a web interface in order to grant them access, right? You could also just have an interface pop up on the web that says, "Hey, here's a payment that's due." So I think you could go really deep in this and talk about like big time distributed architecture changes for payment infrastructure. But I think that's probably not the most pragmatic way to get there, and it would take too long. And people want to start making money today. So I think still a lot to figure out here. Even API monetization still hasn't been figured out for a lot of people. It's still a very difficult topic.
Yeah.
So I think this is even another layer of difficulty on top of that. So I think we'll see some early solutions here and maybe some standards. But I think we can expect that to be kind of a rapidly changing area over the next few years.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us, and it's great to have you back here on the channel as well. If you would like to see more of Kevin's insights, then there is also a video that I will link in the description below, and I'll put a card up there for it as well, with Kevin talking about OpenAPI a couple of years ago. Still a great conversation, well worth taking a look at. Kevin, very much appreciate your time and your insights as ever. Thanks so much for joining us here. Have a great rest of your day, sir.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks for having me.